All right, welcome to our live session. My name is Michael Nichols. I'm here with my colleague, Louisa Wagner. We're from Bosch Management Consulting, where we focus heavily on innovation. And today we're going to talk about something I think that's near and dear to our hearts. I gave a presentation a little while back about, banning pitches in a corporate context, and we'll talk more about that today. And the feedback was quite good. And the ambition here is really to challenge ourselves as innovation managers, innovation leaders, executives, consultants, coaches, to try to innovate on innovation, to maybe think of ways to move beyond pitches, or if we're going to use pitches, how can we supplement them to sort of remove some of the problems that I'm going to go through here. And as you're out there, if you want to throw in a comment and ask a question anytime, this is going to be quite informal. Louisa's going to interrupt me and ask maybe some provocative questions that come in as she's watching the presentation, maybe play a little devil's advocate. So I'm going to get started. So we're going to focus heavily on what we mean by evidence-based innovation and what are some of the issues with pitches. So let's start with a quote by Steve Blank. So Steve Blank, I'm sure you're all aware of Steve Blank, who he is, for those of us that focus on doing lean startup, particularly in a corporate context. It's a very interesting quote, and I'd say it's very intellectually humble too, right? That one of the people behind customer discovery and lean startup talks about its actual effect in corporate, and I'll just read it quite briefly, as you can read as well. Lean startup has mostly resulted in innovation theater, a set of activities, typically like incubators and accelerators. We run our own corporate accelerator as an FYI inside a company that generate coffee cups, posters, and lanyards, and almost nothing else. My test is this: did it move the top or bottom line? What I often get back is, let me show you our dogs at work policy. That's obviously it's joking that, and maybe Louisa, I'll ask you. I think you first came across this concept of innovation theater when I said it. How do you understand it these days?
Yeah, I think so. As you already mentioned, as I started at Bosch Innovation Consulting, I think you were one of the first persons who introduced the innovation theater to me. And I think it's such a precise description of what many corporates, and I also think that startups do that you act like you're doing innovation, but to be honest, you don't do innovation because it's more on the surface. It's looking like innovation, but deep in practice, it is not.
Yeah. Or worse, I mean, the team themselves might actually be taking it seriously, but the people to whom they're pitching may not. Maybe it's more about the event and the feelings and
Publicity things. Yeah.
publicity and marketing, and we'll go into that, because what I want to do is take this quote and we're going to focus on whether pitching is actually innovation theater or not. And that's what the rest of this presentation is going to look like. So the goal here then is to increase skepticism about pitches. Doesn't necessarily mean ban them outright, although I tend to think that way, and maybe Louisa does as well. And to liberate us from some of the myths or the mythology that surround entrepreneurship in general in corporate, and another buzzword, entrepreneurship, and pitching, whether it's really entrepreneurship or not, and sort of set the stage. You can see here when you're looking at these events where pitches often take place, I mean, the buzz is real, the hype is real, you feel super motivated, it's electric when you're in those sorts of environments. If you've ever been to a hackathon, I mean, I'm talking here about banning pitching or moving beyond it, but at the same time, they're really cool events to take part in. And I think that's
it seems so very high energy and motivation and innovation and so on.
And you can measure whether something's innovative, I guess, if you look at that bottom picture, by how many Post-it notes are on the wall,
Sure,
right?
sure.
And that's sort of, it's like this playful, creative atmosphere. And we're not, of course, bashing that. But the question is it theater, or is it what Steve Blank was suggesting? Is this going to move the bottom or top line? And so you see lots of events like this. And the question is, what really comes out of that? and I'm going to go into some of the things. So you're at one of these events, and there are buzzwords everywhere. Smart this, data that, data lakes, data clouds, data C. We have Industry 4.0. You have platform business, ecosystems, orchestrating, like it's a symphony, an ecosystem. And the next big thing. And there's a lot of tech push mentality here, R&D, tech enabling disruption, a lot of these words flying around. And then the question is, if you're on the jury side, if you're one of these investors, well, which horse should you bet on? I don't know. Louisa, which one would you, number 4? Looks like it's going to win.
The first or the last? I don't know.
Yeah, the dark horse in the back. And the thing is, how do you choose? This is something I spend a lot of time thinking about. How do you choose when you're at one of these early stage events, right, where the maturity of the idea is really low, even if you've hacked something out? I mean, that's the whole definition of hack something out, and it's a low maturity, but we're just trying to get a sense, could this be a solution? How do you choose? There's a lot of stuff on like team spirit. Was the what did you feel from the founder? Was he or she, were they charismatic? Did the team seem like they wanted it? And then you have the sort of gut feel. I liked it. Then you have seen, and we've seen applause-o-meters, right? So
best evidence ever.
Yeah, company-wide votes. You get ideathons, or simply executive feel, which is not much different in a lot of cases from gut feel, and I like it. And the question here is are these really good ways? And I'm simplifying, but I'm really talking about early stage. Are these really good ways to choose whether an idea should, one, be invested in, or whether they should go forward? And then what's behind some of this? What are some of the biases at play? And I guess the hope is that if you use these sorts of methods, or use a checklist, or you have some criteria where you're watching these short pitches, that whatever you choose somehow turns into the next unicorn. Now, I've never seen a unicorn. Have you seen a unicorn in real life?
Not yet. Let's hope that one day I will see one.
And I'm not trying to kill the ambition, right? But I think we often forget how rare they are. The probability that you find a unicorn is way lower than 1%. And in the definition of a unicorn is something like a $1 billion valuation. That doesn't even mean you have revenue for that much. It could be some, divided by 10, you have 100 million is the revenue, and then you're valued at 1 billion. So the hope is, go ahead.
Yeah, I think sometimes that's really the problem, that when you focus so much on establishing or reaching the billion-dollar company, you just lose focus on the real market need and the customers, and then you just create something that nobody wants.
Perhaps, or maybe it is the shiny unicorn. Let's see. But often what comes out of this is that thing that we all believed and hoped and were motivated, and we had a lot of spirit to go out and prove was a unicorn. We put lots of effort into it, but it turns into something we would call a Walking Dead horse, or The Walking Dead. It's somehow in year, the 9th season of The Walking Dead, but nobody can figure out, is anyone watching anymore? And should we actually put this thing to put it to bed finally? And why? So then what do you do when you end up in one of these situations where you've publicly committed to presumably what you thought was a unicorn, but it ends up being rather one of these zombie projects that just keeps going on, eating up funding? So some things you see out there is, well, change the writer, because if you go back to startup mythology, well, the founder is one of the main reasons for the success of a project. Nobody would deny that a team or a founder or a leader has influence, but is that the reason it's failing? Not necessarily clear, but it's one of the favorite methods. Let's change the writer. Must be the writer. Okay, maybe that's not working. Let's increase the funding. Maybe the writer doesn't have enough money. We can sort of buy some growth and put some more in, make the user experience better, all these things you can think of. Okay, that didn't work. Maybe we need a reorganization. Maybe that project is not set up correctly. Okay, that didn't work. Maybe we should decrease the funding, because the next thing comes in startup mythology. Well, startups don't have very much funding, and they move fast, and they're inspired by not having so much money. They have motivation. Yeah, so you bleed them dry, and then that doesn't work. Okay, that didn't work. Let's hire an external startup executive, because Well, maybe the corporate employees, they just don't have the right stuff. And that already says a lot if you take this step. So you hire the external startup executive. That doesn't seem to work for some reason. Why that might be. And then, well, you take the next step, you hire consultancy. Then you just never mention the project again. Now, I did not say that the project died. You just don't talk about it anymore. Maybe it's still out there. Maybe it's in zombie mode permanently. It doesn't. So why does, I think the question is, why does this thing happen? And what I think if you think through Steve Blank's statement there, and if you look at the things that he's pushing and we spend a lot of time well, you made a decision based on very little evidence very early. I think the better question is, like, how could this not happen? Right? Because your innovation is inherently plagued by, high failure rates. And as long as you didn't have evidence for these things that we're listing here, did you know who the customer was? And Louisa, you said it the best, like with the unicorn, did we know the market need? Did we really know the customer problem that was being attacked, particularly in these pitches when it's often tech-centric, right? We're going to do the next AI thing, right? And we're going to do something in IoT. And the technology seems brilliant. And then somehow what's lost there, and there are lots of use cases, but what's lost is, yeah, but which customer really has a need that's strong enough to pay you for it? Are there enough of those customers to justify going further with it? Have you tested that? And even if you find a market need in a nice segment, do we as a company have the channels, or are you going to build them directly? Can we build it? Should we build it? Might we need partners if we go down this road? Is the thing repeatable, scalable, profitable? Where will this land? And when you're in corporate, you have to think heavily about that. Are we really committed, if we're actually successful, to scaling this thing and putting the resources in? And what capabilities are we leveraging in our corporation to say, hey, this makes sense for us to do? Yeah, not just some crazy idea that doesn't fit inside the corporation, but should we do this? And so these things aren't really brought up in the pitch, and it's unclear in a pitch if they've even been addressed. In a lot of cases, we'll come to why that is. And you're making this decision with a high degree of uncertainty. And this is one, I think, where the first problem comes with pitches is, are we really doing due diligence during a pitch on these investments? So let's go on. But you hear justifications for why we should continue to do pitches, even if there are problems. And I'll talk about the justifications. I'll talk about maybe some of the problems. And probably the first one's the one I hear most often is like, okay, well, yeah, maybe it's going to end up as a zombie project, but really, pitching is about transforming our culture. It's about taking risks and it's about learning to sell. And the question I would have there, are we really transforming our culture when the entire basis of a pitch, at least in the corporate context, is we appeal to hierarchy? We're pitching to high-level executives and asking them if the idea is good, essentially. Is it good? Can we do it? For me, that's actually the definition of hierarchy. It's not giving the ownership of that idea and the evidence gathering to the team. So this is, for me, what I see as one of the big problems is we're not actually creating entrepreneurship or an environment that's entrepreneurial, although the events are awesome, right? We already admitted that. We're actually appealing to a hierarchy, and we'll come to another problem with that later, that may or may not have any idea whether there is a market need for this thing. That's problematic. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what would you say, how could you then really transform the culture? So what should be implemented in the pitching or in the investment decision? How can you transform this culture by pitches? Or is there any possibility how you can not reinforce that hierarchy?
So I'll answer at a high level, and then we're going to come into detail how at least we approach it at Bosch in our innovation consulting efforts. Doesn't mean that's the right answer either. It's an attempt. I think you can't entirely get rid of hierarchy, right? You do need stakeholders who are going to ultimately be investors. But the question is this event sending the right message to the organization? We'll come to, I think, some alternatives. Maybe the listeners out there, you have some ideas what could be alternatives. Maybe you disagree with us completely. That's also fine. We're quite used to that. But we'll talk about what we think could be an alternative, at least how we do it. Another one you hear is, this, and it's related to the culture thing. It's not all about business. I mean, like Steve Blank, yeah, we want to move profit, but this is also a learning opportunity for the entrepreneurs, right, in these teams. They're going to learn. It's, and then the third point is going to motivate them. Well, I think this is a false binary. I relate it to sports in a lot of ways. You can have fun and win, right? You can do both. And actually, teams that win probably are having much more fun. And I think it's the same in entrepreneurship, that you can seek a business, and it can be all about business, finding and making an impact on your company, while at the same time learning true entrepreneurship, also building a good culture. So it's not the case, I think, that if you optimize business, you lose the other. Or if you optimize culture, you might lose business. That might actually be true. What to think about that. But it's not the case that it's completely a black and white or a binary. And does it truly motivate the employees? Because if they find out at the end of the game, when they're a dead horse, there are many reasons why you might become a dead horse. Are they motivated when they find out it was actually theater? That was more about the event? I think, this is my hypothesis, and you're younger than I am, so I'll ask you. I think young people are motivated by purpose. They want to make a difference. And like Steve Blank says, they want to move the bottom line and guarantee the future of their company. But maybe I'm wrong.
No, so at least I agree.
All right. So those are a few points. You might disagree, but I think there are at least some valid points that you can raise, as at least from the cultural point of view, that might be problematic when you're pushing pitches. Another thing that comes to my mind is, like, what are we actually measuring in a pitch? When you see things like, is it the right team? And I think one thing that has an undue influence, and I have to tell you this, I'm American. I come from a storytelling culture. We love stories. We're good at telling them, I have to say. But storytelling can have an undue influence on the jury. And if you're good at it, there are some problems with that. One is, if the person telling the story, I don't have this problem, but if the person telling the story is attractive, then you tend to overrate all of the evidence, all of their abilities. Or another version of that is, the person pitching is supported by a high-level executive, they're automatically getting rated higher. And I think this is something, it's human, and you can't blame anybody for this. It's something that really can be problematic. So sales, we're testing their ability to sell. Well, good storytellers know some of the biases out there. One of those biases is availability bias. It sounds something like this. Let's say we're in automotive, and I say, last year, if we had this technology, that one accident, you remember that accident you read about in the news last year, caused a scandal, that a baby and a young mother died in the accident. If they had that technology, they would have survived. That's why you need our product. The effect of that? The effect of that, there are two effects. One is, if you don't sympathize with that, you're a monster, first of all, right? All right, that's number one.
No other chance.
Number two is, you took one event in the entirety of the world, and our human brain has this problem where, if the evidence is available, we tend to overestimate the probability. So this sounds like it might happen again. And if you implement this, you're saving lots of young mothers and babies.
Yeah, I think in your article you also mentioned another very good example with the airplane crashes. That in the news you hear from one airplane crash, I don't know, every 2 or 3 years, so it's not very often. But then people are more feared of airplane crashes than car crashes or car accidents, which happen very so.
Rare, they happen every day, right?
Exactly,
I mean,
exactly.
In Germany with your Autobahn, I mean, if you crash, it's a bad crash, right?
That's right.
And one of the things we forget is if something, shark attacks are another good example, by the way. If something's in the news, it's almost by definition rare.
Yeah.
And we forget that. And why is that important? Well, because later we're looking for really a scalable, repeatable model, right? So we have a comment from Subin, and I mean, we totally agree that we need to be able to answer this question: why, if it's about motivation, right, of the people, why should they go to the extra mile if they even smell that it might be theater? And so, even if it's not theater, even if that's not the intention, we should, I think, get rid of the smell. Like we should at least try to make it where it doesn't even look like theater. It should look like business, right? It should look serious, so that the teams are motivated. So on to motivation. So we measure the motivation of the founding team. I'm curious how you do that. You know me, I'm a very even keel person, so it would be very difficult to say whether I'm motivated or not. But one bias here at play is people who are naturally extroverted. They come across as charismatic, as energetic. And those happen to be sort of, I think, in the mythology, characteristics that are what, investors might say, those are the things we need. We need somebody who's going to persevere, has that energy, because startups, they're working late at night, they're under their tables sleeping, and you got to have that energy. But there is some evidence out there, and there's conflicting evidence, that actually a lot of startup founders are disagreeable people, introverted, which means you wouldn't even like them if you talked to them. And if you did talk to them, they might disagree with you. And then the question is, okay, are we even looking for the right things? Or does it have a chance to be present in a pitch? Right? Okay, and then the last one is, and I mentioned that with the last one, team matters. But a lot of these teams, I mean, I don't want to say names, but think of some of the most recent entrepreneurs that lead huge companies now, whether those people are nice guys or nice gals. Would you have hired them at the HR gates? Here's another one. There's one of my favorite ones, maybe, just to joke somewhat. If HR is talking to you like, how entrepreneurial are you? And you're in a corporate entry and you say, well, yeah, I'm super entrepreneurial. The first idea I have, I'm leaving and I'm going to have my own startup. Right? Yeah. Well, you're not a fit, right? So these are some problems. I don't think you can get away with, get rid of them even without pitches. I don't want to say that. So we need to somehow, and this is what Manuel's saying, we need to find a way to convince investors that on the emotional level, but also provide evidence. And it's not really a contradiction in the end. We have to be aware of those emotional biases because they're going to happen anyway, while at the same time balancing it out with evidence. So we'll come to how we think that might happen. Any thoughts there?
So I have one question or one thought maybe. So I think it's also very important from the investors' side that they are aware of those emotional bias or whatever, that they know they should not only decide by the story, by the people that are standing on stage and telling their story, but that they should really focus on the evidence that are there. So I think it's not always just from the people doing the pitches.
Right. And this is my opinion. I think this is something that's not addressed very well in management training and in leadership training. You might have one class on organizational behavior in your MBA or in your business class, but is it enough? did you internalize it? Did you know that these things would happen in this sort of environment where actually the decisions are crucial? It's about actually the future of the company in both your employees and in the ideas that might be your next big business models. So for me, I like to say innovation is a personnel or an HR problem. And this is one of the reasons is that leaders who move up need to be aware, no matter how great they are, no matter how much success they've had, they also are subject to these. I'm subject to them. I watch Disney movies with my daughters all the time, and I'm getting older, and I'm emotionally affected by the same things. So we have to be aware that we're all subject to them, and then we have to think, how can we mitigate the effect of these things, these biases, on our own decision making? And that's the goal, right? How can we make really good decisions on both, as Manuel pointed out, the emotional level and on the reason level? So here's another thing that strikes me. If you think about these events, I mean, you're lucky if you get 5 minutes in a pitch. I mean, we heard elevator pitch is 30 seconds. So somewhere between 30 seconds and 5 minutes. What strikes me about this is for the core business, we spend the entire year planning, investigating, forecasting. If you want to do something new in the core, like even add a new process, 90 slides of a PowerPoint. That PowerPoint has been edited 100 times before an executive sees it. You go into months of this. And when we're talking about the future of our business with a new idea, 5 minutes? Is that enough time? And I have to say, this is really in those early stages I'm talking about. If you have a program in place where you're testing it over time and then pitching, yeah, maybe. Okay, but still, is that enough time? Can executives not spend more than 5 minutes with these projects to really dig into the evidence? You could find ways around that, possibly. I mean, I don't know how you would make a good decision in 5 minutes, but the contrast is the problem. Because if it's about culture, this tells me core business is important. This event over here is not important to me. It's a sandbox. It's often junior managers on these projects. It's sort of delegated out, play in your sandbox, pitch, but it's not as serious as the stuff these real executives over there are doing. That's harmful, I think. And I think in general, we need to have more balance where we place more emphasis on how seriously we treat the exploratory stuff.
Yeah. So to me, this also sounds like innovation theater again. So it's like I'm doing as if this would be important for me, but to be honest, I don't really care.
Even if it's not, right? So even if you think this is the right way and you're taking it seriously, what message are you sending with it, though? It might be taken as, oh, this is not as important as I don't know, whatever the latest strategic thing is you're working on in the core. And related to that, in the core, when you need to fix something, money's available, you fix it, right? All hands on deck. When you're an innovation project, we want a unicorn, but you only get a few $1,000s. And then there's a mismatch there too. How seriously are we taking these projects? Now, in the early stages, probably that's the right amount of money to give, but as they move on, are we really committing the resources necessary to ensure? I mean, if you want a unicorn, you want $1 billion in revenue, not just the valuation, you probably have to be willing to commit $1 billion in investment. It's just kind of a rule of thumb. I could be wrong there, but significantly more than a couple $1,000s or even a couple million euros, since we work in a European company. So just think about it. Are we really signaling the right things to the organization with this, even if they're serious? Even if you believe that's the right way, is that really the right signal? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But to me, I think it has a lot to do with mythology, that it's done this way outside, but I'm not even sure it's done like this outside anymore. Maybe for ideation campaigns or something. Now, why is this also problematic? Well, Let's look at the second line here. So we know startups fail a lot. And that top line number, if it's new to you, it's the failure rate if you don't receive a three times return on your investment. That's what you have to receive to cover all the losses of all the ones that failed. So there's high failure rates in startups in general in the world. VCs fail all the time too. I think that probably makes sense if you think about the first statistic. So you're talking about the most brilliant financial minds sitting in San Francisco, London. I sit in Singapore, sitting here also, Shanghai, lots of ones sitting in Israel these days. I think what's the big one in Germany these days, Louisa? Berlin, right? Berlin.
I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Brightest minds in the world, financial minds sitting there, fail a lot. They fail a lot. And another one, you can look through those numbers, right? Unicorns are super rare. We already talked about that. Failure is endemic in innovation. And so for me, and you see this quote here, right? The only way to do lean is if you actually accept that the fact that 99% of your visionaries, maybe those extroverted, good storytelling entrepreneurs, are actually just hallucinating. It's not a vision, it's a hallucination, as our friends at UC Berkeley like to say. So this reflects back on who you're putting in the jury. Do they have the skills even to pick winners? When even the best in the world, when we're looking at fundamentally new ideas, struggle with this. And the question is not to say, hey, we can get rid of this failure. It's like, how can we reduce the risk? And there are two types of risk. One is you choose bad ideas early. And this is particularly the risk in a pitch event, and invest too much. So they end up being the zombie and they're eating up lots of cash and they are killing with opportunity costs all the other ideas that could have been tested, which is the second risk, is that you've killed ideas that might actually could have had an impact, but they were never truly vetted other than a pitch. So I don't know the perfect answer here. It's just something that bothers me is that when failure rates are so high, are the people choosing really the right people to make those decisions? You might counter me. Let me just play devil's advocate against myself. You might say, well, the failure rates are so high, it doesn't matter. Just choose any of them. So it really doesn't matter in the end. But we'll come to why that might also be problematic later. If you have to choose a method, why a pitch could be just as good as any of them for sorting them out. So we'll come back to that. And then the number one reason startups fail, this comes from CB Insights. It's post-mortem done on lots of startups out there. If you're interested, you can find their website and check it out. The number one reason that these new ventures fail, which goes against, I think, our expectations, which often seem to be, particularly in a corporate environment, the product wasn't good enough, the team didn't execute, it was the wrong leader. It turns out the main reason is not the team wasn't doing a job or they didn't have a product that was finished. It's that nobody wants it. And getting people to change their behavior and discovering the market need, that's the number one thing a team has to do. And this goes back to, does the team at that early stage when they're pitching, or even a little bit later, or the investors, do they know the market need? Have they done the market validation, talking to real people in the ecosystem, validating, running demos, MVPs, customer interviews? Have they done that work to know if that exists? Later, we'll talk about how you can get some early indicators of this before you make a decision whether to proceed. But at the early stage, this is very uncertain. Interestingly, team is on there, but it's lower down than you would expect from the language you hear around entrepreneurship. Seems to be a lot of emphasis on the characteristics of the founder. But we just have to remember that market need is the thing. Okay.
Michael,
I
have one question. Question.
Sure.
So in the last 30 minutes, you mentioned several things why pitches are not up to date anymore. So why you should move beyond those pitches. But where is this beyond? So what are potential alternatives? What can you do instead of pitching?
Yeah, and we have a question in the comments that goes to it. We mentioned the two types of errors, right? The first error is investing in a loser, so getting a false positive in a pitch environment, and then the other is the false negative, right, where you've wrongly shut something down. And we need to address both. So what are some alternatives? So here we're going to talk about how we've approached it, at least in Bosch Management Consulting, together with our partners at UC Berkeley, when we've been running our accelerator program, and how we've learned to deal with it. So the first thing we've done is embraced failure literally. Those numbers we saw with failure rates up in the high 90%, 80%, whatever number you're using, it's always quite high. And what I mean by embracing failure is not this buzzwordy thing where we say we should embrace failure, but all of our behavior otherwise suggests that failure is not acceptable. We mean it literally, that we should accept that those rates might be impossible to change. And therefore, we need to change the way that we think about innovation from the beginning all the way to the end, starting with strategic investments. And we're particularly here going to be talking about highly exploratory things, new business models. Going all in too early seems to be very unwise for when you have a high probability of failure. And this, unfortunately, tends to be the case. I think it's a misidentification of the space you're in. Because in the core business, you can make investments like this, and they sometimes, more often than not, will work out. And typically you'll build an organization, put the right people on it, and they execute. But when it's exploratory and it's highly uncertain, you don't know that market need, this is not what you should do. You're going into heavily before you even know what it is. And often attached to this would be targets like in EBIT and revenue targets by the end of the year, before you even know maybe what the product is or what the market need is, if you have channels, all these things. And that seems like both culturally and business-wise, you're setting people up for failure. And the bigger problem with it is on the right, is that you've gone all in before you've collected evidence. Right? Before you know whether you should have gone all in, you've invested quite heavily. Maybe you've done desktop research, maybe you've done some customer interviews, but it doesn't mitigate the problem of failure as much as it could. Still do all that, but there are other ways to approach it. And one of those ways is prioritize bets, place lots of bets out there, lots of ideas, test them quickly, efficiently, and then over time, as you've de-risked it, you can still invest in those big fat organizations, but only when you have evidence to do so. Another way to think about that, when you think about the traditional way of investing in products, is, well, we often invest millions in a technology, and it takes years to develop before we do the market validation, the business validation. Now, this can make sense, right? If you're in your core business and you know the customer needs, they're even telling you the requirements. But if you take this approach when it's exploratory, we have so much uncertainty, you're bound to fail. You're bound to wrap up too much money in losers when you could get the same amount of validation, which we're going to talk about very briefly, by going out doing the market validation before or in tandem with the technology development, getting feedback from the market much earlier, spending way less money. And even if you invested that $3 million later, you're still getting an increase on your net present value. Why? Because you're delaying capital investments for when you have better evidence. It's a very financial way of thinking, but it's also de-risking. The first way, if you misidentify the context, is highly risky, which is strange when you think about it, because corporates are typically risk averse. But then we're doing things that are actually quite risky when it comes to new business and investments. And why that is, it's a good question. So let's go on from here. what we're really talking about here is optionality. Instead of making a decision at the front end which projects and organizations we're going to build, why don't we wait just slightly, a couple months, a year, to test very cheaply on the market, as you saw. I mean, if you have 250,000, you can test one idea. With 3 million, you test one idea. You can test lots of ideas and place lots of bets. Give yourself the option to figure out which one of those bets, even if you spent the 3 million, but you're spending it across multiple projects, is the right one to invest in. And what's forgotten there is the value to abandon is super high because you can free up the cash and reinvest in other bets. And this is talking from the principles of embracing failure and then making investments in that way. But there are other benefits that we talked about where we were questioning whether pitches are actually providing any sort of cultural benefits. If you do this and you instill a culture that understands failure rates, where the failure rates are transparent, we don't hide them. Like we know when we're exploring new business, most things will fail. Then you really will get a culture of experimentation. Because failure is not a result of, and this is, I think, the most pernicious myth when it comes to founders and teams, it's not necessarily a failure of the team. The best teams, and we've seen them, they can go out, do the greatest work, and still fail because they failed to find a market need. And that's actually a victory because it means you didn't invest in something that's going to end up being a loser. So the whole principle here is we have to fail enough, place enough bets so that winners have a chance to emerge and that we only invest and make the organization fat when we have a model that can succeed and we have evidence from the market that can succeed. And this is one way. You don't need a pitch anywhere in there to do it. You can have checkpoints. You can make this a systematic approach without large pitch events. If you want to still have it, and this is where I'll concede, do the pitch later, right? When you have customers already paying, you validated the value proposition, the channels and everything else, the business model is repeatable, then have that big event because then you actually have a reason to celebrate.
Yeah, I think what is maybe from my perspective, what is a good point of integrating the pitching to this whole entrepreneurship thing is that you try to integrate the whole spirit of pitching, that you bring things to the point when you try to explain it to others, but not the decision of the pitching event that is linked to the investment.
Yeah. And another thing, one of the things that makes corporate so powerful is, let's say that the team pitching it is the wrong team. Maybe you come to that conclusion, but they're not good at selling. Well, if the idea is still good, you have multiple thousands of people that could replace them that could sell if the idea is still good. So why give up on that idea? It could still be valuable for the company. And just to mention one other fallacy that's quite big is the sunk cost fallacy, that if we've chosen a project, and particularly if somebody high up has put their name on it, we have to persevere and keep going because we put so much into it. And that's the sunk cost fallacy. The way you should decide is always based on the evidence in front of you, projecting the value of a project in the future, not by what you put into it to that day. So that's one thing we can try to get rid of. Another thing is principal agent problem, that there's often an incentive for these innovation projects to build headcount, to build organization for their own career, and not necessarily because it's good for the company or for the project. So one rule of thumb here is you should never have more headcount than customers. It's a very simple rule of thumb. So these are some other things that you can benefit from if you take an alternative approach. Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about how we approach it philosophically at Bosch, embracing some of the failure rates, at least in our program, and going out and validating things, giving ourselves optionality, having more of a portfolio mindset. But to do that, you can't just have the philosophy. You have to have a structure in place to be able to measure whether you're moving forward. And here you'll see many of these frameworks out in the world. Some will say something like ideate, incubate, scale. You might have 4 circles, 5, many more. Well, here you see ours, and it's because we've chosen to focus on a few areas. One thing in corporate that you have to make sure of is that you're doing something that's strategically aligned with the capabilities of your company, with the resources you have. And that might seem a little strange to have in an innovation framework, but it's absolutely crucial because some of the problems that arise that we'll probably address here in a minute. But want to make sure that you're taking capabilities, that you're addressing real problems in the market, that you create solutions for real problems in the market. Take it out, see if you can find a business model that works, experiment, see if you can build the solution, see if it sticks, repeat it, scale it. That's what this process is all about at a high level. And that's necessary to have when you're running a portfolio to know where projects are in that process. So if you run such a process, then you need to have an idea what the deliverables are to prove, right, that you have strategic framing, that you have a real customer need. And one of the things that we put into place is we like to measure the maturity of projects running through the funnel. Now, this does 2 things. One is for the portfolio, the person running the portfolio, the manager of it, they understand that as projects are going through the funnel and increasing their maturity, and we're embracing optionality and saying, should we go on or should we abandon? They understand where those teams are in the process. And this is not like stage gate, right? Because you can move backwards, you can revalidate. So from their point of view, it's a good governance tool. And the way this looks in the end is the following. You end up being able to see, like a heat map, where in the business model projects have validated things, how mature are they? But it's also important for teams in such a funnel to know the rules of the game, to know the criteria by which they're being judged, to know what to do next. Often they don't know because when it comes to entrepreneurship, they may not have had any experience with it. So this, from the one side, it helps on governance, running a portfolio, financing, knowing when to say yes, when to say no. And then for the teams to know what are the criteria that we're actually expected to deliver. And instead of depending on gut feel and I like it or charisma, we depend more on, is this a good business for our company and is it validated? So that's the idea behind it. So you need those pieces, the philosophy to finance it appropriately, run a portfolio, to measure the teams in it, also to enable the teams to know what to deliver. And if they're not delivering, either stop the project or help them get to the next step. So that's what we've done. And another thing where we've tried to approach pitches differently is to say something like, well, let's enable the teams. That's the real transformation we want if we want entrepreneurship. Let's enable the teams to make their own go, no-go decisions. And let's make sure that their investors are on board with that. And this is an alternative you could consider. It doesn't mean it's perfect. But what it does is it says, when a team is in this space where they're investigating in this program, whether an idea is good or bad, they have the ability to kill or proceed based on the evidence. And the truth is, you would expect most teams to say yes or go for their own career's sake. The truth is, the vast majority do not. Because why? Younger people are purpose-driven. They don't want to work on a loser. This is their life, right? You don't want to spend 1-2 years on something when it's quite clear that it might be a loser. So we have a question over here I want to pop in. So what ratio between product development and customer sales experts has the highest probability to be successful based on your experience? I think what the issue is we work in businesses often where, because the business model is known, we've cut these up into separate processes. And product development is often done by a separate group, like you say here, technical experts. And then the idea is, I'm going to use the German phrase, we throw the baby over the fence to the marketing people, figure out how to sell it. And that can work in the core. The problem is it can really fail quite badly in exploratory. And I don't know the exact probability, but I think if you're only doing tech push, you're really, and the number one problem is market need. It's the number one reason things fail. And you're really taking a huge risk if you're pushing something out there without validating the market side. On the other side, and we've seen it, if you only have creative marketing types like where I come from, maybe I don't know if marketing is your background, and they have these pie in the sky ideas that nobody can build, that also will not work. So the ideal situation is, how can we bring product development and customer discovery together so that we're doing market validation simultaneously to product development, and those people are actually talking to each other? Because the problem comes when, and we've had product development people come through our program, they say they'll never do it the old way again, because they came to the realization they're building things that are fundamentally misaligned with the needs of the customer, or they're building things for which there was no need. So I don't know if there's a number to this, but there's risks in both directions. And when you're talking about exploratory things, when the number one thing is market need, this is a big risk to take. It's a very, very great question, though, and there's not a perfect answer. But when failure rates are really high, I think we just need to make sure that we're not making that basic mistake of assuming this is an execution waterfall project when it might need market validation simultaneously. And we've seen, working with R&D people, you can improve their ability to test the market while experimenting with new technologies to say, is there going to be a need at the end of the day so we can improve our conversion rates? Now, we run that accelerator program. We've started to help companies, internally and externally with some of the things, these approaches that we have. We can help you think through, innovation process design. How can you create such an environment? How can you assess the maturity of projects going through your portfolio? Is it really the team, or is it really there's no market need? Is it really something about the business model? And we do workshops and trainings, and there you can see our team. So just to wrap it up, the intent here was really to start thinking about, I think, pitches in innovation theater in a broader context. Our pitch is really signaling the things we want them to signal. Are they really achieving the things we want to achieve? And as some of the questions came in, how can we transform our culture so they can take more ownership of their projects, to know that it wasn't just theater, that when we get to the end, we're going to have proper support and investment, and we'll be able to really make an impact. I talked too much there. Okay. Any questions, Louisa? Any follow-up things? Any thoughts, final thoughts? And then maybe we'll have a few more questions come in.
So I think, what is my biggest takeaway from what you just said? I think innovation and the whole entrepreneurship is very much focused on the culture. And I think it's very important that you can establish a failure culture in your company, and that you're very transparent when it comes to innovation projects, that everyone knows that your projects are that there are very high failure rates behind innovation initiatives. And then I think you can really drive those innovation projects very efficiently and evidence-based and so on. And I think,
if you're honest and transparent, I mean, a modern leadership is about authenticity, transparency, being honest. And I think if you make the process clear, make the probability of success and failure clear, give clear deliverables by which they will actually be judged, and not just, do I like it, right? And that's important for creating a new culture. But beyond that, what we're not saying is that you need to transform the culture of your entire company. I at least have the view, let the core do what the core does best. Let them run those processes that are often problematic for startups. Let them produce the cash. Without them, there is no innovation, right? There is no cash for innovation. But separately, and this is sort of the thoughts of ambidexterity, when you're doing explore, set up a separate system for measuring, for a separate culture, even an organization, to test things, so that it's so that we don't end up in theater, so that the exploration is treated just as seriously as the core. And it's clear, the signals are clear that it's just as important. I think that would be the ultimate goal.
Yeah.
And I think that's what all of us as innovation professionals are looking for. And this is one way that we look at it. It's our own experiment. I'm sure you have found your own ways. And the idea here is to really challenge ourselves to innovate, on how we innovate.
Exactly.
All right. I think that's it. We'll wrap it up right there. Thanks for everybody who dropped in a question. I hope it was at least interesting for you. If you have any comments afterwards, please drop them. We'll surely try to answer. Agreements, disagreements, everything's open, right? It's innovation. We're all trying to improve. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Bye-bye.